We're at a point in the course where we have covered a lot of the material that comes up as problems in the case. So there should be nothing confusing about the material. During this past year, while Congress failed miserably in trying to reform the immigration law, and immigration enforcement took off without control, I've been feeling that I was there before, that I was witnessing history repeating itself. Slowly but surely, efforts to fix the law fizzed out, and efforts to enforce the law became the order of the day to such an extent where even today in my practice, I wrote a letter to some high officials of ICE to explain to them what they were doing wrong in the methods that they were using to arrest people and to incarcerate them, to deny them the right to have their own medications or medical attention, and to ship them thousands of miles away from their homes, where legal representation was not really available to them. It seemed to me that I was witnessing again what had happened years ago. In fact, President Bush the other day vetoed a statutory amendment that would have required, in dealing with people apprehended who were suspected terrorists, that the CIA carry on their apprehensions and detentions in the same way that the federal government does in the court system and that the Army does under military rule. That wasn't sufficient for the president, who on occasion, I think, has this feeling that when he acts as commander-in-chief, what he says is the rule is a matter of law which cannot be broken. It reminds me of a time just three and a half decades ago when we had a president who also thought that he had imperial rule, and that what he did, if he said it was correct, that made it the law. I can't help but feel that I'm witnessing history go by once again. 3 decades of gray hair haven't dulled my memory. In the old days, the president had, operating out of the White House, a slush fund of cash, which was distributed to a number of well-known former officials of the federal government, so that they could conduct such activities as burglaries, illegal break-ins, clandestine surveillance operations, and so on, which were clearly criminal. And yet the president authorized it. And his attorney general, who was formerly his law partner, a fellow by the name of John Mitchell, agreed that everything he was doing was legal. Now, you may not be old enough to remember that Mr. Nixon was forced out of office and had to resign. And Mr. Mitchell spent time in jail. And G. Gordon Liddy and a few other names that were famous at the time also ended up in jail for conducting break-ins and burglaries. But it was the same kind of situation. There was a war going on that was highly unpopular. Before Iraq, there was Vietnam. And there was this feeling in the federal government that what we do is right and legal just because we do it. The only difference is, I have to say, that at that time there were more people who were willing to stand up to it and say, this is wrong. Our government is entitled to be known for something on a much higher level. I had the privilege of representing such a person who protested the unpopular war and a lot of the other activities of the government and suffered for his outspokenness. About a month before I met John Lennon, he appeared at a rally in Ann Arbor, Michigan, in support of a fellow named John Sinclair. John Sinclair had been convicted of possessing, selling 2 marijuana cigarettes, and was sentenced to jail for 10 years. It was so outrageous that John Lennon and Yoko Ono joined a group of other musicians and performed there. He wrote a song for the occasion called "It Ain't Fair, John Sinclair." And he and many others performed and spoke up against the Vietnam War. In fact, a few of them were known for their talks about dumping Nixon, who was the president at the time. Approximately 2 days after the performance, the government in Michigan changed the law, and it was determined that a 10-year sentence was not valid under the new law. And John Sinclair was released from prison. Of course, those that had arranged the rally were convinced that it was their rally that did it. But I'm not so sure about that. Certainly, their speaking up drew the attention of a lot of people. When John and Yoko got up to sing that new song at 3 o'clock in the morning, there were 15,000 people in the audience, and most of them came because they heard that John and Yoko would be there. That kind of introduced my clients to the FBI, because apparently among those 15,000 people, there were more than one FBI agent. Everybody who was there had some connection which would have made the FBI interested in being there. Among those who performed and were on the stage, I think about 5 of the Chicago 7 were present, and they were guilty of criminal activity, the way it was described, in upsetting the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968. And there was something very special about 1972 when all this took place. What was special was that this was the first year, and it would be the first national election in which the voting age was reduced from 21 to 18. Now that put about 5 million new voters possibly exercising their right to vote. And President Nixon was very, very concerned about that. And of course, he had this feeling that if he decided to do something, that made it legal. And we're going to hear a bit about what he decided to do and how that affected my clients. And then again, what I was able to do about it. John and Yoko had come in several months before that on a very special purpose. Yoko was previously married and had a child about 8 years old at the time called Kyoko, who was with her father, Tony Cox. I didn't learn this till much later in the case, but she had once been a resident of the United States based on the sponsorship of Tony Cox, and then gave it up or lost it or just didn't follow up on it. On one of his visits, Tony absconded with the child. John and Yoko spent months trailing him wherever there was a rumor that they showed up in some European country. They would fly there, and of course, the newspapers flew quicker than they, and as a result, Tony Cox and the child would be gone by the time they settled into a hotel room. What she had come to the United States for now was to get custody of her child. She had appeared in the court in the it's the U.S. Federal Court, actually, in St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands, where their divorce had been granted, and that court entered an order giving her custody and giving the father visitation. The father absconded with the child, went to a different jurisdiction in Harris County, Texas, started another proceeding. John and Yoko were there to testify, and the court gave them custody once again. And again, Tony disappeared with the child. This time, though, the court entered an order holding him in contempt. I was called in the beginning of the case to draft the order for the judge's signature. And you'll see why after a little while. I placed in that order a requirement that Yoko and John raise the child within the territorial limits of the United States. That wasn't necessary for the order itself, but I wanted it there. John had a conviction for what was alleged to be marijuana in London 4 years earlier. And whenever he came in, he needed to get a waiver of that conviction for purposes of a temporary trip. There was no waiver with respect to permanent residence. You could get a permission to come in on a humanitarian basis or for business. There were special reasons, and it had to go through both the State Department and the Justice Department at the time. And each time he didn't seem to have any difficulty getting that permission. So when I received a call at my office in mid-January of '72. They were already here in the United States for a couple of months, and they had accomplished quite a bit, but they were most frustrated with the fact that they didn't get an opportunity to get custody, physical custody of Kyoko. And this bothered Yoko a lot. She was a good mother. And it bothered John a lot because as a stepfather, nobody could have been more devoted to that child. The call came in from a former classmate of mine at law school, and he invited me to come down to their village digs to consult with them. He said they have some immigration problems and they'd like to consult with you. What he didn't tell me was that he had probably taken several other lawyers down before me, because the questions that they asked when I got there were very, very knowledgeable questions. Their apartment was not a big or impressive apartment. You stepped down 2 steps into a living room which was furnished like a stock room. It had Xerox machines and file cabinets and so on. And then beyond that, there was a kitchen and a dinette together. And beyond that, I didn't see it that night, but I'd been there many times subsequently, there was a 2-story high, large bedroom with a big double bed and a big TV at the foot of the bed. And generally, John liked to watch TV there with the sound off. He just liked the colors. And that's where they entertained. And that's where we conducted, for the next 5 years, many meetings with people I needed to meet with. She came out first and explained that she had come for this purpose, and she was afraid that the government might not extend their stay. I was there on January 19th, and the stay was valid until January 31st. And when she explained all that, I didn't see a problem with getting an extension. I hadn't heard of a reason that was more compelling than the fact that a mother is looking for a child to permit her to visit the United States for a longer period of time and get that done. Then John emerged. Now, I had no predilections or preconceptions of what they would look like or who they were, because I am embarrassed to admit I had no idea who they were. And the attorney who took me there, when I explained that in the car going down, said, "Don't you ever admit it." He was a very bright, very cheerful, real nice guy. When he came in to the room, he immediately asked, "Can I make you tea?" Tay, he calls it. And he started puttering with that while he told me his story about his conviction. And I could see the picture coming together as to why Yoko would be concerned whether she'd get more time, because he had a problem in his background. She didn't. He explained that he had this conviction in London, and his attorneys advised him to plead guilty. And I asked him, when they showed me the conviction, which didn't say the word marijuana, it said cannabis resin. I said, "What's cannabis resin? Is that marijuana?" He said, "Oh no, that's better than marijuana," he said. "That's hash." And lights started going off in my mind, because the statute was very clear at the time. It said people who are excludable and deportable from the United States are those who had any offense, didn't even have to be a criminal offense, involving narcotic drugs or marijuana. And that was put into the law, I recall, because of some California cases where it only said narcotic drugs. And some bright lawyer down there raised the question that marijuana was a hallucinogen, not a narcotic. They amended the statute immediately. I asked him, did you plead guilty or was there a trial? And he said, oh no, my lawyer advised me to plead guilty. And he said, you have to follow your lawyer's advice, don't you? Well, why wouldn't you follow your lawyer's advice? Well, because I wasn't guilty, he said. Detective Sergeant Norman Pilcher, a rogue in charge of the Scotland Yard drug squad, had already bagged some other guys. He said Mick and George, and I was supposed to know who Mick and George were. He planted the drugs on him. He said, we knew that we might have been next on his list because he was hitting one rock musician after another. He was convinced that they were corrupting the youth of England with their music. And as a result, he said, we didn't have any drugs in the apartment. In fact, we were on a macrobiotic diet, and that didn't allow for drugs. And I said, you pled guilty? He said, yes, I followed my lawyer's advice. Isn't that the right thing to do? I said, I don't know. I can't imagine a good lawyer, and he could afford the best, advising someone to plead guilty in those circumstances. Well, he said the others pled guilty and got fined 150 pounds, and that was the end of it. And the only difference is, he says, in coming to the United States, I need to get a special waiver, which slows down the process. And he says, I can never be a resident of the United States. I wasn't going to ask him who told him that, because I could tell by their questions that there were other lawyers there. And I said, is there anything else you want to tell me? He said, yeah, there's a new law in England called the Uniform Rehabilitation of Offenders Act. And it says that if you have been convicted of one of these offenses and you haven't been reconvicted in the next 5 years, it will be eliminated from the record. And in fact, he said it will be libelous if somebody ever says or writes that you had such a conviction. Yoko says, what do you think you can do? What's your advice? Well, I said, I might not agree with John's impression that it's impossible to get residence. I haven't heard any cases where someone with a marijuana conviction won, except those California cases. I remembered that, but then they changed the law. I said, but you've told me several things that are extraordinary. Number one, John may not have a conviction involving marijuana. Cannabis resin, he just explained to me, is not marijuana. It's worse or better, depending on your point of view. Second, I said, he's just told me that there may be something about the law in England that may make it improper to use his conviction as a basis of exclusion from the United States or deportation. Because there may be an element that is different from our system there, because he was not guilty, and a good lawyer probably told him, and Mick and whatever his name was, George, that they had to plead guilty. It was the same lawyer, apparently. And finally, I said, in another year, when this gets removed from the statutes of Great Britain, I don't think that it would necessarily affect the law here, but that's a brand new question which will never have been determined before. And that could raise, all these questions could raise a beautiful issues before a federal court. I said, I don't think if he gets into trouble and they start a proceeding to remove him, that we could win the proceeding. But I said, if we get to federal court with these arguments, I think that he's got some chance of getting residence. And I tried to explain it in as ethical a way as I could without raising their hopes too high. And finally, Yoko said, well, how would you handle that if we were in deportation proceedings? I said, what I would do is file 2 third preference applications for you. That's currently the first preference, extraordinary alien in the arts or sciences. And I would file, first I said I would file for John, and then I said, well, that might not work, because if the government approved your case for residence administratively before an immigration judge, and then they denied his residence case, you would have no basis to get your residence because it was his application. So I would file 2 third preferences for you, hoping to be able to prove that both of you are extraordinary aliens in the arts or sciences. The statute read whose presence in the United States is prospectively beneficial to the U.S. cultural interests or something like that. But I said, if all you're asking for is a couple of months, I said, your attorney here, my former classmate, is capable of doing that, and if you'd like me to, I'll be happy to look at the papers. I said, I've never seen as strong a reason for an extension of a visitor's stay. And little did I know that it would be eventually denied. To that, and this was the first time I ever saw this, John and Yoko answered in unison, "We need you." And then, of course, after telling them that they could use the telephone number that I gave them, except on Friday night and Saturday, because that's my Sabbath and I don't take the phone, which they accepted wholeheartedly. They took my number and said, we will be in touch with you. And they didn't want to do that without the approval of the chairman of Apple Records, which they were using at the time. This chairman, Alan Klein, was formerly the manager of the Beatles for many years. And if you were one of his accounts, you didn't make these decisions without clearing it with him. What happened then was that I went to see my old friend Saul Marks, who was the district director in New York. And I figured it would be simple. I would just explain to him the extraordinary reason for a visitor's stay that was needed, and he would give me all the time that I needed. And he listened carefully and said, Leon, I'll have to let you know tomorrow. I'll call you. This was a small item for a district director. I had even told him that they had seen several other attorneys, including Edward Bennett Williams, who said that if they're put in deportation proceedings, I told Marks that he would file a lawsuit as the proceeding to prove that the proceedings violated the First Amendment, because aliens do have the right to First Amendment privileges in the United States. I just wanted him to know that he would be better off with me than some high-powered First Amendment lawyer, because it would get to be a big fight. The next day he called me and he said, Leon, because it's you, I'm giving them a month, but I want them out of the United States. Tell them to get out. What a hell of a way to speak to honored guests. I figured there was some reason that Yoko seemed to sense that the government would not be going along being nice to them. I learned later on that she has this oriental or female kind of sensitivity to things that are going to happen. In any event, I called them and I told them, and we sent over the papers, and we got a month's extension. Then they didn't leave because there wasn't enough time to do what they needed to do. So the government gave them 2 weeks of voluntary departure, satisfactory departure it was called at the time, saying that from March 1st to March 16th, they could remain in the United States. On March 3rd, I filed 2 third preference applications. And from that point on, I was no longer a stranger to who John and Yoko were, because to file one of those things, you have to research every aspect of their lives. References that were attached from Andy Warhol, Clive Barnes, Jasper Johns, Stanley Kubrick, Elia Kazan, Claes Oldenburg, Leonard Bernstein, Virgil Thompson. And of course, all these papers were delivered to my office by a young girl named May Pang. You may recognize the name because she just came out with a book of photographs taken on a year-long weekend with John. On the 6th, 2 days later, I was served personally. 2 immigration officers came to my office and served me personally with a letter saying that they are revoking the period of permission to depart voluntarily until the 16th, forthwith, and a deportation hearing will be held on the 16th. There were just enough days in the old system to issue it. And the next day, they served the same thing on me again, except now there was a further ground of deportation. The first one was an overstay, which of course Saul Marx created by revoking the time he gave to leave. And the second one was that they had violated status. Whatever it was, they were obviously falling over one another's feet down there to get this thing done quick, fast, in a hurry. And I was getting that message. They tried to serve it on John and Yoko, but they refused to open the door. So it was slid under the door, and that was the personal service. On the 16th, I, believe it or not, performers, public people, are often very, very bashful about appearing in court proceedings. They didn't know what to wear, they didn't know how to conduct themselves, and they were just scared. So what I did was, I said, what we'll do, and they told me that when they get there will be hundreds or thousands of people at the front door asking them questions as they go into the building, because everybody will know about it. So I called my colleague and opponent, the chief trial attorney of the Immigration Service, a fellow named Vinny Sciano, who just passed away recently and was one of my dear friends and the the top lawyer that immigration had anywhere in the United States. And I said, Vinny, they're very nervous, and maybe we could come in the back door, and maybe we could spend some time with you so that they would get over this fear of what's going on. He said, of course, Leon. And I brought him in, and Vinny had his son there, and he was trying to make it as pleasant as possible, and he succeeded, because after discussing the Lennon music, which he was an expert in, for about 20 minutes, he buzzed me and whispered in my ear. He said, Leon, I don't think they realize that I'm the prosecuting lawyer. I said, John, Yoko, you see, it's not that terrible a place. And witness the fact that Vinny here, your friend who's so knowledgeable about your music and so on, he's the prosecuting lawyer. Lennon got down on his knees, took a handkerchief out of his pocket, and started polishing Shiano's shoes. Is there anything else I can do for you, sir? Yes. We went into the hearing, and of course we had to ask for an adjournment, because I was going to make my first motion, which would have something to do with improper notice, and so on, and a lot of other things that had occurred to me. I think it was the next meeting where the government had decided that they would like to separate the proceedings into two different cases. John before one judge and Yoko before another. And I had told them the first time I met them that it's very important that this come together, and that if we can get 2/3 preferences approved, to prove that you are a couple and that you're to be treated as a family, approving both of those applications as outstanding artists, and then denying one case and granting the other, would force you, Yoko, I said, to be able to say that it's inhuman for anybody to force a woman to choose between her husband and her child. And that was almost a prediction, because that came up in a later meeting. The next meeting, they didn't know what to wear. My practice was to pick them up at about 6 o'clock in the morning at their apartment. They would send a car for me. And I asked them at that time, because the motion was going to be made to sever them into two separate cases. I said I wanted them to look like two salt shakers, not even one salt and pepper. I wanted them to look like they were a matched set. I said, what have you got to wear that is the same? It took us a little while, but they both had black suits, white shirts, and he had 2 black ties, so she wore a tie as well. And I said, I want you to sit together on the table, at the table next to me, and hold hands. And no matter who says that you should separate or one of you should move, you just whimper or cry or whatever, don't move. That was the only motion that I won in that proceeding. Everything that I went for was opposed by the government and upheld. That opposition was upheld by Immigration Judge Field Steele, who was one of the best people in the field. But he was also convinced that whatever you call it, it's still marijuana, and let's get. Another hearing, when we came back to the office of the former manager of the Beatles, I recall that he had this magnificent office. To get there, you had to go through a corridor with hundreds of gold records framed on the walls. When you got into his office, he had 2 walls that were completely glass. And we were sitting there at a long desk. He had an immense desk, eating lunch. Geraldo Rivera had known the Lennons before, and he was there with us as well. And we were talking about President Nixon and John Mitchell, his Attorney General. Now, Attorney General meant in charge of immigration, the whole Justice Department. Immigration was part of the Justice Department, not Homeland Security as it is now. Just sitting there, all of a sudden, and talking about Mitchell, all of a sudden, two window washers on a scaffold started rising to get to the windows of this office. And John sees it out of the corner of his eye, stands up and says, "I'm sorry, Mr. Mitchell, I didn't mean a word of it." He was so convinced that he was being followed, and he was, but I don't think that he was being followed that early in the case. At that time, this was the most active case in my office, and my life changed. I used to practice ordinary immigration law from 9 to 5, and at night, after having dinner, I would go to meet with John and Yoko almost every night, either at their apartment in the village or in the record plant where they recorded. It was really something to watch this man in a record, in the record plant. It looked like the inside of an airplane with all the equipment around, and he seemed to know exactly where to go to adjust something. Detective Sergeant Pilcher had been arrested. He was charged with perverting the course of justice, meaning planting drugs on people and then arresting them. I arranged for staff in England to monitor all of his legal proceedings. We even spoke to him, but of course he wouldn't admit that he'd been doing this for years, to John and George and Mick and others. The FBI started tailing the Lennons. Pilcher ran to Australia because England does not have an extradition treaty with Australia. And I actually let my hair grow. Bought my first pair of jeans at age 42. And John he cut his hair shorter than it was, and John bought an immigration suit. Just a regular suit. He wouldn't wear a tie all the time, but he had an immigration suit because he wanted to be respectful when he came to court. I had to arrange to see the records that they had under the Freedom of Information Act. Because there was a hearing coming up, I wanted to be sure that I wouldn't be surprised with anything. So I arranged with the district director at the time to have them put out all the files they had on Lennon. There were a lot from various trips of the Beatles to the United States and so on. What they never showed me, and therefore I didn't know, was that Yoko was once a resident of the United States, and my third preference petitions were not there. The hearing was scheduled for a few days ahead of that, after that, And I figured if I don't have third preference petitions approved, I can't file an adjustment of status application for my clients. And it dawned on me that this was serious. So I started making loud noises like a loud lawyer, which is not easy for me. But all of a sudden, a big envelope shows up, and I opened it, and there are my 2 third preference petitions, the way I stapled them together with my 2 little hands, and never touched. And I overheard a clerk saying to the other something about that they were in a safe. Forget the guy's name, the chairman of the adjustment of state of the applications unit, in his safe. I went to see the district director straight from there, and I said, you haven't touched these applications. They should have been sent immediately to the Labor Department for an opinion under the old system, and then you should have adjudicated them. He said, I will not talk to you about it. Then I knew that the squeeze was on, and that either he was pulling the punches or they were doing it from Washington, and they were not going to adjudicate those applications, so I could never apply for residence. They were convinced that they had Lennon where they wanted him, because if he couldn't apply for adjustment of status, all he could ask for is voluntary departure in his deportation hearing, and then he would have to leave immediately. If he couldn't apply for adjustment of status, we were really in trouble, and they had essentially won. So for the first time, when I saw that Mr. Marks was not going to cooperate, I prepared papers for an action in mandamus, requiring the district director to adjudicate the application that had been filed with him 2 months earlier. At the same time, I wasn't going to be able to wait. I filed a motion for a temporary injunction against further delay, and they granted that. And I looked forward to the fact that there would be an immediate hearing in 2 days. Now, what I was really looking forward to was some answer to my motion papers, because in my motion papers, I alleged on information and belief that there was a conspiracy in Washington to get him out of the United States for political reasons, and that this was being held up and would not be adjudicated unless the court ordered it be done. The court ordered the adjudication. When I got to court, the judge called us forward, the U.S. attorney and myself, and said, I have a telephone call from one Saul Marks, who said that he's adjudicating the application today. Now, the return date happened to be the adjourned date of the deportation case. I didn't want to go to immigration from that hearing. I said, Judge, if I will not agree to this unless I see it in writing, an approval or a denial in each application, and would you hold on to this until we have such a thing? And he agreed. Judge Whitman Knapp, it was. He agreed to hold on to it, and the next day I had 2 approvals. Now, I wasn't so sure he was going to approve Yoko's application, but they figured it didn't make any difference. And they fell into what I considered my trap, which was to have them approve both applications. And shortly I could anticipate that they would be ruling that John had to leave or be deported, and Yoko could remain by adjustment of status. That was the first of 3 separate lawsuits on the matter. Now, it took about a year for Judge Fieldsteel to reach a decision. I brought in a fellow by the name of Dr. Lester Grinspoon, who was the foremost authority in the United States on marijuana. And he testified that, well, it wasn't so easy to get him. I called him and I asked him, is cannabis resin marijuana? He said, no, it's hash. And hash, he said to me, is not marijuana, even though it comes from the same plant. So, and I said, would you testify to that? He said, yes, as I used to testify, I would be happy to testify to that, but I don't testify anymore. His name was given to me by Alan Dershowitz at Harvard, who had used him as a witness. I guess I tried to call Dershowitz again, see if I could get another expert. And the next day I got a call from Dr. Grinspoon. And he said, do I have time to change my mind about testifying? I said, absolutely. We would be thrilled. You can name your price. He said, I have to tell you, he said, he had a 12-year-old son with terminal leukemia. And he said, when he got home that night, he told his wife about my call. And he was at the table. The child was at the table. And he said, I hadn't realized that Lennon was his hero. He said, can you get me things autographed by Lennon? I arranged for him to stay at the plaza, I remember. And the night before I went out, I didn't rely on the stuff in that storage room they had. I went out and bought all kinds of records and books or anything he did. And I had him autograph everything. And I brought it to the hotel so he would have it before he testified. And he testified the next day. The judge and the trial attorney didn't know what to do with it. He submitted his book as his authority. He had authorities, he had references, 5 single typed pages of references at the head of Harvard's psychiatric department and so on. The decision came down a year later, and there it was. John is denied residence. We anticipated it, and Yoko is approved. They were out of town at the time. And Saul Marks, in 38 years representing the government, had never had a press conference, but he must have been instructed to try to mollify the adverse reports that will come out because Lennon was so popular. He called me and said, would you like to participate? He said, Mr. Schiano, the trial attorney, will be there, and would you like to say a few words and so on and answer questions as well? Well, I had no intention of saying a few words or cooperating with him because by now I realized he was on the wrong side. However, what I did do was I ordered a steno, and I called John and I said, I need all your people in the New Left media, Zoo World. I don't even remember the names, but there were about 10. For that press conference, you needed to get in, you needed a press card. And there were 10 people. Rolling Stone was the best known among them. And to each one, I gave a question to ask Mr. Marks. Make a long story short, he lied through his teeth. He said it was his decision, that he had no choice but to bring this proceeding. There was no such thing as a non-priority program which would have allowed him to allow somebody to remain in the United States although he was completely deportable. In checking the records, I found that the day before he testified there and said that there is no such program, he had approved a non-priority case himself and sent it on to Washington. After his press conference, we held ours, and that's when we said that we were appealing to the Board of Immigration Appeals. And from that point on, I sat back at the press conference while John and Yoko took over. They waved white handkerchiefs, and they said that they were declaring the state of Newtopia. And anybody can become a citizen. It has no borders and no immigration laws. I was anxious. I hope they were not going to say no immigration lawyers, but they were kind to me. It took me until October of 2003 to file the other lawsuits that the materials you have read. First, the non-priority lawsuit under the Freedom of Information Act, which was the first time that that provision of law was used as the basis of a lawsuit in an immigration case. And ultimately, they delivered to my house, my office, a box so high with every approved case. And there were something like 1,800 of them. Aliens allowed to remain in the United States despite the fact that they were deportable. Some of them had 10 and 12 drug offenses and worse. The other one was my selective prosecution lawsuit, where I claimed that the government violated 5 different amendments to the Constitution. Now, it was in those lawsuits, which were taken up before the same judge, Judge Owen. I really think I lucked out, because Judge Owen was a recognized composer, a musician of note, and a composer, and a great lover of music. I never discussed that with him, didn't know that it was so at the time. And during that time, he allowed me to do a certain amount of discovery. And I want to just tell you about a couple of pages in the John Lennon and Yoko Ono files, which were noted as being confidential files. A letter dated February 4, 1972, on the U.S. Senate letterhead of Strom Thurmond, and he says, "Find attached a memorandum to me from the staff of the Internal Security Subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee. I'm a member of the subcommittee as well as of the full Judiciary Committee. This appears to me to be an important matter, and I think it would be well for it to be considered at the highest level." Now, this letter is addressed to Attorney General John N. Mitchell. There isn't much higher in terms of level than John Mitchell, or lower depending upon your opinion. As I can see, many headaches might be avoided if appropriate action be taken in time. With kindest regards and best wishes. And he says at the bottom in his scrawl, I also sent Bill Timmons a copy of the memorandum. Bill Timmons is the White House. He was the congressional liaison to the White House, and he would have delivered it to 2 guys named Haldeman and Ehrlichman, who were, when you were talking to them, you were talking to the president. Now, here's the memo that was attached, titled John Lennon. John Lennon, presently visiting in the United States, a British citizen. He was a member of the former musical group known as the Beatles. At least this guy knew. He has claimed a date of birth of September 10, 1940, and presently married to a Japanese citizen, one Yoko Ono. On the December 1271 issue of the New York Times showed that they appeared for 10 minutes at 3 o'clock a.m. on December 11, 1971. Now, they often, in these things, attribute it to a newspaper so that they are not called upon to show who the witness is. Obviously, this is the John Sinclair rally, December 10th, and they had their people there in Ann Arbor, Michigan, to protest the continuing imprisonment of John Sinclair, a radical poet. Radical New Left leaders Rennie Davis, Jerry Rubin, Leslie Bacon, Stu Alpert, Jay Craven, and others have recently gone to the New York City area. This group has been strong advocates of the program to, quote, dump Nixon. They have devised a plan to hold rock concerts in various primary election states for the following purposes: to obtain access to college campuses, to stimulate the 18-year-old registration, to press for legislation legalizing marijuana, to finance their activities, and to recruit persons to come to San Diego during the Republican National Convention in August '72. These individuals are the same persons who were instrumental in disrupting the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968. According to a confidential source whose information has proved reliable in the past, the activities of Davis and his group will follow the pattern of the rally mentioned above with respect to John Sinclair. David Sinclair, the brother of John, will be the road manager for these rock festivals. Davis and his cohorts intend to use John Lennon as a drawing card to promote the success of the rock festivals and rallies. The source feels that this will pour tremendous amounts of money into the coffers of the New Left and can only inevitably lead to a clash between a controlled mob organized by this group and law enforcement officials in San Diego. The source felt that if Lennon's visa is terminated, it would be a strategy countermeasure. The source also noted the caution which must be taken with regard to the possible alienation of the so-called 18-year-old vote if Lennon is expelled from the country. Now, the one that interested me the most was dated March 2nd. That is a few days before we filed the third preference petition. And this is a memo for the files of John and Yoko from Saul Marks, signed by him as district director. He says, Associate Commissioner Green telephonically advised today that we should immediately revoke the voluntary departure granted to John Lennon and his wife. Incidentally, he stated at his press conference that it was his idea. An order to show cause should be issued for both aliens and served upon them with a return date of March 16, '72. He also stated that he chose the date. Mr. Green further stated that under no circumstances should this office approve the I-140 filed by Lennon. This is a direction of Commissioner Farrell personally. Further action on the petition will therefore not be taken unless cleared by the undersigned with Mr. Green. Paragraph, Mr. Spivak has been advised, and it's a CC to Mr. Spivak, the head of applications. That's where the envelope came from, with the two applications untouched by human hands. I didn't know this when I started these lawsuits. I was alleging things that sounded like this. Pretty soon, in that lawsuit of selective prosecution, I spoke about surveillance and wiretaps, about the government starting a ground for deportation by creating it, about the fact that Yoko was placed in deportation proceedings and she was perfectly legal when that her status was valid the entire time. There was no reason to deny that, to cancel that. The extension of, the refusal of extensions, hiding the third preference petitions, even though I hadn't seen this memo, refusals under the Freedom of Information Act to give me the stuff that I had to sue for about the non-priority procedures, all of which amounted to violations of the First, Fourth, Fifth, and Ninth Amendments. Mail covers, wiretaps, surveillance. It was a very exciting complaint to draft. In October of '73, I argued the case before the Board of Immigration Appeals, and Vinnie Shiano and I went down by plane together to argue the case, and it was the few times in its history that they sat en banc. All 9 members listened to argument. In November, 2 months later, Norman Pilcher in England was found guilty of perverting the course of justice. I had somebody visit him in jail to see whether he was willing to give us anything that would help us here. Of course, he wasn't. The Board of Immigration Appeals then affirmed the immigration judge's decision. They classified it as a precedent decision. They were so convinced that they were right, that Lennon was not eligible for adjustment of status, and that all these arguments that I had made about the fact that this was not marijuana, and the fact by then I had the opinions of several professors of law in universities in the UK, and the fact that the law was changed in 1971 in the UK, and the word knowingly was added to the statute so that you could no longer be convicted in England of possession of an unlawful substance unless the government proved that you knew that you had it. All that the BIA did not agree on, and as I had told the Lennons much earlier, I didn't expect the administrative body, the immigration judge, the immigration service, or the Board of Immigration Appeals to rule in our favor. As part of a pretrial hearing in the federal court on both of these lawsuits, I asked for Saul Marks to testify. Because he was such an old friend, or at least used to be a good friend, I called in an associate counsel to question him, but he immediately admitted that he lied at his press conference, and that all those questions were answered incorrectly because I had the steno's notes, which she had certified to, and it was clear that he was just covering himself. I asked him whether Washington asked him to lie, and he said no, he did that on his own. 38 years with the Immigration Service, and the highest position he held in New York. And I would say, in some part, because of my reference. When he was applying to become district director, he was given an opportunity to get one lawyer out in the field. At the time, I was president of our Bar Association, and he asked me. And I gave him a reference, but I told him I would not do it for the Bar Association. I would do it personally on my personal letterhead, and I did. And the reason that I stated that he was better qualified than the other applicant was the fact that later in life he went to law school. And I felt that a district director who was a lawyer was likely to be fairer and follow the law more correctly. But maybe I have misjudged it. We filed our application for non-priority, and it was rejected. District Director Marks rejected it, and it had to go on to other offices in the region in Vermont and then in Washington to be approved. But because he rejected it, it was never sent on at all. Because of my lawsuit under the Freedom of Information Act, the United States Attorney in the Southern District of New York ruled that the Immigration Service should reconsider that application, and that anyone who had anything to do with the case before was disqualified from dealing with it now. And of course, this was before Yoko ultimately gave birth, and she had had obstetrical problems in the past. And as a result, we were able to show a good deal about the hardship that she was suffering and would suffer if they were not granted non-priority consideration. And we were also able to show John's considerate help to her. He was an extraordinary human being. He never let her alone. She never attended a doctor's appointment on her own. And there was a history of this because she went through a miscarriage, I believe, in London. And there were photos in all the papers of London, which I used in support of this application. Something like "No Sleep for Beetle John," and they have a picture of him lying on the floor next to her bed. This was about 2 weeks before the final decision of the Court of Appeals. So you have, at the same time, two lawsuits in the district court, one on Freedom of Information Act non-priority, the other on which claiming selective prosecution, and on which the judge is allowing us to do limited discovery. And two weeks before the Court of Appeals finally reversed everything and granted Lennon, well, they don't grant residence. They held that the conviction on our first argument, which was that the British law that the conviction that it produced without mens rea, without a mens rea requirement, should not be recognized in the United States. We won on that, and we never got to the issue. I think it's never been determined whether a cannabis resin conviction amounts to a marijuana conviction, but it's not pertinent anymore because the statute has been changed, and now any listed narcotic or any listed, what's the term, drug would be sufficient. It didn't have to be marijuana anymore. So that question is not going to come up in the future. 2 weeks later, well, they approved the non-priority, which meant that after 5 years in the United States without a status. They allowed him to remain, and he would not be removed, and that case would be checked every 2 years like every non-priority case. And they would have been able to stay indefinitely without getting residence. 2 years beyond that, 2 weeks rather, beyond that, the Court of Appeals ruled. Again, I got a call in my office. A clerk from the Second Circuit calls and said, Mr. Wiles, I shouldn't be calling this to you, but he said, you just won your Lennon case. It's a 2-to-1 decision. You've read the decision. And he said, if you will promise that you will not distribute it to other people, he said, I can send it to you, but the judges still have the right to come in and change a word here or there. So I wouldn't want you to show it to anybody else. I sent somebody over for it right away, and I called John. He answered in the high-pitched voice that he always used for answering the telephone because he was sure that his phone and mine were tapped. And I said, John, it's Leon. Oh, the voice changed. I said, you remember the case that we have in the Court of Appeals? He said, remember? You kidding? I said, we won. He was disbelieving. He said, what do you mean? We didn't expect to win. You said that maybe we'll be able to stay here until they change the law or something. Congressman Koch, at the time, he later became the mayor of New York. Congressman Koch had introduced a bill that would have allowed the Attorney General to waive one conviction of a limited amount of possession, of simple possession of marijuana. And it never made it through Congress, but he reintroduced it, and he got about 10 congressmen to co-sign it with him, and a matching one was submitted in the Senate. I got this decision, and John said to me, Yoko is in New York Hospital now, and we expect that she'll give birth any minute. And I was just on my way over. Would you stay at your desk, and Yoko will call you and explain it to her. He never followed all this technical stuff. He just wanted to know the bottom line. And Yoko was highly knowledgeable and understood this case as well as anybody who was a lawyer could understand it, because it was very nuanced. And she called and she said, I said, I'll have a copy of the decision. My clerk just called and said he picked it up downtown. And I won't give you a copy of it, but I just want you to know. And I told, and tell John, I said, that the 2 Jewish judges ruled in his favor, and the Irishman dissented. He fought so hard for the Irish to get the British out of Ireland and so on. And she said, please, you and your wife should come over and we'll read the decision together. And we did that. We got there and she was in bed, almost ready to give birth. And every 5 or 10 minutes, some other hospital orderly or a nurse or somebody would come by and glare at John and Yoko, you know, and we're never quite sure whether they were needed in the room or they just came to look. We read the decision together, And she understood every word of it. And he was so thrilled. The next day was to be his birthday. And Yoko was still doing okay. And he kept saying to her, he was, in dealing with her, he was often like a young boy. Can I tell him now? Can I tell him now? And she said, okay, go ahead and tell him. He said, Leon, I want you to know that you're the only lawyer I can understand. That was his. Second, he says, Yoko and I think you're the best immigration lawyer that could ever be. But he said, you know why we stayed with you and we didn't go with those other guys? He didn't remember the name. He said the guy with liquor on his breath or something like that from Washington. He said, because Yoko's tarot card reader said, stick with Leon, he's going to win the case. I didn't know quite how to answer that. I just said, God bless tarot card readers, you know. The decision of the court, you've read. But I just want to quote one sentence that I think typifies what the chief judge in writing the decision meant. He said, if in our 200 years of independence we have in some measure realized our ideals, it is in large part because we have always found a place for those committed to the spirit of liberty and willing to help implement it. Lennon's 4-year battle to remain in our country is testimony to his faith in this American dream. He deserved that. Lennon deserved that. Because what was special about him was that no matter what he was exposed to, all the abuse that he received from the government, he never stopped, he never changed his attitude, he never stopped speaking up against the Vietnam War and the other things that some of us are complaining about still now, which were part of President Nixon's legacy. The decision stated that the case could now be completed since the immigration judge had never ruled on a discretionary basis as to whether John Lennon should be granted residence. This matter is being remanded to the immigration judge to conduct a hearing so that he could exercise his discretion. And of course, we all knew that there was nothing negative that would now be raised. Nixon was already, I think, out of office. All that other nonsense had gone by. Lennon thought that they just didn't know what to do with him because he didn't seem to fit into any of the categories, and he was left over like from a former war. And it was sent back. I remember that was my younger son's 9th birthday. And in the 5.5 years of handling the case, while my sons watched this, you met my older son who lectured here 2 weeks ago. They were very, very attuned, despite their age. They really followed this very closely. The hearing was scheduled for January 27, 1976. And the immigration judge then allowed us to put a couple of our friends on the witness stand. And they included Dick Cavett, Reverend Moore, who was the head of the British Church in the United States, the Church of England. Gloria Swanson, who met John and Yoko in a health food store, and they shared a lot of interest in such things. Isamu Noguchi, who was a Japanese who spoke about raising their child in the United States and how wonderful it is to raise a child of mixed background in this country as compared with other countries where they're not as broad-minded. I remember when we left the courtroom, Yoko coming over and giving a big kiss to my 9-year-old son. They're being very, very thrilled. An interesting experience was the night that we were in the hospital room and Yoko was ready to give birth. My wife nudged me and said, she's feeling uncomfortable now. I think we should leave. And we did. But she said to John before we left, John, no matter what time it is, just call us and tell us how everything is when the baby is born. And we went home. I think it was already 2 o'clock when we left the hospital. And about 5 o'clock in the morning, the phone rings. And I don't know, I'm usually pretty good with very little sleep. But I was not awake when I answered it. And I said, who is this? And he says, John. I said, John who? He said, John Lennon, he said, and I have a beautiful boy. That's my favorite song of his. And that day, I thought it would be appropriate. We used to buy gifts for one another, especially for Sean as he was growing up. And it was my wife's suggestion that I go out to Mark Cross and see if I could get him a piece of leather goods or something. And as I came into the store, you know how it is when you see a newspaper, sometimes the headline comes forward to you. And that's how it was here. In a showcase, I saw a passport case emblazoned with the Great Seal of the United States. And I said to the girl, this is a true story, I said to the girl, that's what I want to get for John. And she says, John who? I didn't want to tell her because she wouldn't believe me. I think it was after that I came up to the apartment and had to wait for them to sign some papers or whatever. And I went into the kind of living room that they have, and it was all furnished in an almost white, off beige. The couch and the rug, the carpeting, everything. And there was also in the room a huge grand piano, beautiful piece. At the time, I was taking piano lessons. I gave it up because if I don't do something well, I don't have the patience to stick to it. But my sons were both taking piano lessons, And I decided to have this teacher stay an extra half hour and give me a lesson every time. So I opened the piano and I started playing my Dear King Wenceslaus or whatever it was, strictly a child's piece. And John walks in and says, "Leon, I didn't know you played the piano." We had gotten to know each other quite well by then. And there I was with my new pair of jeans. And he didn't have to wear his immigration suit anymore. And I said, "Well, it's not exactly playing. I'm taking some lessons." He said, "At your age?" He was only 6 years younger than I. Yoko is my age. And I said, "Well, before I let the teacher leave, I get a half hour." And then Yoko walks in. And John turns to her and says, "Yoko, Leon plays the piano." "I don't even know how to read music," he said. "All I can do," and he leaned over and pressed keys. He says, "all I can do is play chords like that." So I said, something corny like, "Don't worry, it won't affect your career." And then he said, "Yoko, when Sean gets old enough to learn piano, I'm going to take lessons with him." And I don't think that he lived long enough for that to happen. It was 5 years later that he passed away. And things haven't changed that much. And again, as I said when we started, we've returned to the philosophy that aliens are truly aliens, and that we need not accommodate them by our law necessarily, forcing them into illegal situations, because there simply are not enough numbers under our quota system to allow in the number that we need. And I say that purposely. It's not just a question of allowing people in who want to come in, but we are an aging population and we need young workers, and we are stopping them from coming in. And what's going on is that you can't even run for president today unless you come out against immigration, even if you once were in favor of it and ultimately will be again. We're entitled to more as a nation of immigrants. And we have to speak up about those things. The anti-immigration forces have now unified with hate groups, and it's becoming very difficult to speak in favor of broader immigration rules and larger quotas. Local legislation now is provoking a lot of problems, trying to weed aliens out of individual communities, trying to stop highway support funds for those who give aliens the right to drive in the United States and so on. And the saddest thing about it is that nobody seems to be speaking up against it. I miss my courageous old friend. I wish that he was here, and I can only imagine that life might be a little different in the immigration sphere if he were. That's it, folks. Our next session is on political asylum. We couldn't pull that in Lennon's case because England would never refuse to accept him or mistreat him. But it is a method by which many otherwise impossible cases. He arranged to stay here and gain status in the United States. So we'll see you next week. Hi.
My boyfriend is from Serbia. He has a green card, but he went to Aruba on Sunday, and when he was exiting, the customs officer couldn't find Serbia on the list, so he put him down from under the Soviet Union. Would that cause any problems upon re-entry? When it
No.
I didn't.
It's just that they, when I studied geography, half of these countries didn't exist.
Well,
either,
he asked. He said, "Look up Yugoslavia."
Yeah.
Look up former
Would be
Yugoslavia.
more approved.